Good evening. This evening, we have a topic that you've probably not heard preached on directly before because it's something that we kind of turn away from most of the time. And if you looked at the bulletin, you saw the title was Conservation and Christians. And when we use the word conservation here, we're talking about in the ecological sense, that is, in the environmental sense. And so that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. And we usually, when we hear something about environmentalism or a lot of the things that are being pushed today, we tend to turn away from that or even almost mock the idea. And we'll talk about some of the reasons for that potentially. Or if not that, we just kind of look the other way and we say, well, that's something that somebody else is concerned about, but not something that I need to be concerned about. I'll also say as we start that this lesson comes very much from a book that I read this past month and felt that it was worth sharing. And so this is a summary of something that you don't have to read now, but also a lot of things that aren't necessarily from that we'll bring into it. But when it comes to talking about Christians and the environment as a whole, there's usually one of a few camps that you might fall into. On the one side, there are people that are misled, but they are almost militant against the environment around them. And so they are more than happy to use the world as their garbage can, essentially. And they think trees are just a nuisance. They think that animal life is just to be gotten rid of, and it's an inconvenience to them. And they usually will justify this based off of the verses that we read that say that man is supposed to have dominion over the created world. But we'll talk about that at length as we go through. But that's the one camp. The other camp that's probably more common among Christians is indifference, apathy, just not caring one way or the other, and they're not interested in nature at large. They don't care about any animal life except if they have a pet maybe, but they don't really care. It's not something that affects them directly. And then you have the other camp. The third camp is that group that, while they claim Christianity, they make environmentalism into almost an idol, something that could replace God under the right circumstances. And so they are maybe still Christian to some extent, but they are alarmed by climate change and believe it's exclusively man-made. They ride their bicycles to work. They don't eat meat. They do all the things that you probably think of. And so those groups, we want to recognize that we probably fall somewhere on that spectrum of how we view the environment. And the question is, how should we? And so what we want to do next is we want to take a look at the ideas of what the Bible has to say on this topic, and then we'll make some application as well. But the first thing I think we need to do is to potentially change the terminology that we use. Because so far I've been deliberate in calling this issue one of the environment and one of nature. But if you're a Christian, and if you believe in the Word of God, then what is the environment? Is that really the right word for it? Instead, the Christian should recognize and start reframing the discussion not as the environment, not as nature, not as the great outdoors, but as the creation of God. Does that make a difference from the start? If I say that I care about the environment or that I care about God's creation, it changes the ownership, it changes the total understanding, or it should. Because when we talk about environmentalism, that sounds a whole lot like what somebody who is almost crazed in their thinking, that they're viewing it as their own possession, that they're the ones that are supposed to be taking care of this because it's our world and it's all these things. Well, it's not. It is God's creation, it's God's possession. And so are we going to view this as something for somebody else to take care of, or as Christians, what are we going to do with it? Because it's not the world's possession, it's God's. And so it is God's creation. So when we talk about the creation, instead of saying that you're a nature lover, you're someone that loves God's creation, what He has made in this world. The second thing that we need to address is this dominion mandate, as it sometimes gets called. We're reading something maybe a little more scholarly. But the idea that man has dominion over creation. Okay, so if you go back to Genesis chapter 1, And you see in Genesis 1, verse 28, in the verse that was read for us, and this is repeated several times actually in Genesis, even after the fall of man. It says, "Then God blessed them, and God said to them, 'Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over every living thing that moves on the earth.'" He goes on to say that everything is going to be under their control, as it were. And so this would hold true even through today. First point worth making is that if you go back to the original language, the word means to rule, which is not that much different than dominion. And yet, if you were to put that in the context of you ruling over a nation, if you were a president, or maybe take it back to the days of kings, and you say if you're a king and you rule over a certain country, then what makes you a good ruler? Well, there's probably a lot of things, but what makes you a bad ruler? What makes it bad for you to have dominion? The worst thing you could do would be to kill all of your subjects, to destroy everything that has been built. And yet when we talk about the environment, there's still a group of people who are probably well-meaning, but ultimately they use this as a justification to destroy anything that they don't like. Well, that's not good dominion. That's not good ruling over what God has given to mankind. So while this is a real and true authority that God has given, it can certainly be misused. But he has given this authority. And so that's why when we get to the other extreme and we see people who are never willing to cut down a tree, well, that's not it either. God gave us these things to build our houses with. God gave us these things to eat. God gave us these things for a reason. But we have never had a blank check, as it were, for us to just say, you know what, I'm going to destroy anything I want to. Instead, what does God command immediately after he plants a garden in Eden? He says in chapter 2 of Genesis, in verse 15, it says, "The Lord God took the man and put him in the garden of Eden to tend and keep it." Does that sound like dominion, where he's just clear-cutting the garden, where he's burning it and getting rid of everything that he doesn't like? Or does he have a responsibility to take care of it as God would take care of it? Is he just a manager of the things that God has given to him? And that's a small scale, but that's one man and one garden. What is it today? It's a lot of people, and it's a big world, and yet the same responsibility has to be there on some level. So to tend and keep it, other translations say to serve and to guard it, instead of tend and keep. That is maybe a bit stronger language, and makes the question for us is, are we serving God? And even to an extent, are we being servants of his toward what he's created? Or do we not really care about that at all? Next thing I want to talk about, and this is something that you may not know anything about, you may know a great deal about, but the discussion is that of biodiversity. Now, biodiversity is just a compound word that means diversity of life. And usually you're talking about that within a certain area, and so you would say that a rainforest has greater biodiversity than the Arctic tundra, just by nature of where they are on Earth. But biodiversity just means the variation in life that you have in one place. Now, why does that matter when it comes to this discussion? Because number one, God made biodiversity. God could have chosen to make one kind of plant and one kind of animal, and that be it. He didn't. Now, why he didn't, I'll let you ponder that tonight when you're laying in bed, but God chose to make a lot of variety of life, both of plants and of animals. And so we see this in chapter 2 of Genesis as well. In verse 9, it says, once he's planted the Garden of Eden, it says, "Out of the ground the Lord God made every tree grow that is pleasant to the sight and good for food." And then goes on to talk about the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Why? What does it matter? Now, we know today through our modern day science that biodiversity is a good thing, that it makes the ecosystem more resilient when you have more types of life within it. But God does this from the beginning. And so again, what we're saying is God created plants and animals, but even in chapter 2 of Genesis, it's obvious that we're not talking about two kinds of trees that God made. God made biodiversity. He made a lot of different kinds of life. Now again, why does this become important? Because God didn't just create it, he also chose to preserve. And I don't just mean by providence down through the years, I mean God made a specific choice. When you go forward in the book of Genesis, just a few chapters, into chapter 6, you'll remember that God chooses to destroy the earth because of the wickedness of humanity at that time. And what does he have Noah to bring onto the ark? He brings 2 of every kind of animal. Why? Why not just bring along some cattle, maybe a couple goats, maybe whatever a human needs and finds useful? Why preserve all life? Why preserve that diversity? Well, again, he created it, but he created these things for a purpose. And so if God has a purpose, we shouldn't be willing to just discard all of that and say we don't really need that kind of diversity. And so maybe we can ask that question. Why did God create a diversity of animal and plant life? There's really a lot of reasons. And we won't get too far into this, but we could talk about the ecosystem. We could talk about, like we said, that makes it more resilient. We can talk about the food chain, how complex that ends up being, that certain animals only eat certain things, that goes down through that chain. Certainly, different kinds of plants have served us as clothing throughout the years, and even certain kinds of animals at different points. Building materials, there's a wide variety if you happen to be a woodworker as far as wood is concerned. Why does that matter? Because they have different applications. You can only build ships out of certain wood, and certain wood really isn't that great to build a house with. And so there's a diversity there as well. But maybe another reason that we don't always consider. I read an article just this week talking about a particular vine that grows in sub-Saharan Africa that may have applications in curing cancer. Why is there biodiversity? We don't always know. And if we get rid of all of it now, and then we find out later on maybe that particular animal produced some kind of protein that we could have used, too late. And so God created this, he preserves this. But one other thing that we want to say, we're giving reasons that biodiversity might be important. But God created this, and he said it was very good. And so it really doesn't matter, and it isn't needful for me to be able to produce a reason that this animal or that this plant is important to humans. Those animals, those plants, they don't need to justify their existence by being useful to humans. They've already justified their existence by God creating them and calling them very good. And so we get to see biodiversity as it influences, or as it was influenced by God, as it is useful to us, but it's important even if it weren't valuable to us as individuals. But those are just a couple of things that we could talk about from this perspective of how the Bible looks at the created world as far as animal and plant life. But when we're talking about environmentalism, or when we're talking about being good managers of what God has created, what's really the problem that we're usually trying to address? Usually the problems are those of pollution. There are problems of over-harvesting of animals. There's problems of habitat loss. There's problems that we certainly are contributing to as people. But the real question becomes this: why does that happen? Why do people dump pollutants into rivers? Whether that be an individual that litters on the side of the road, or why does a large corporation decide to put all of their waste into a river? Why does that happen? Or why is it that people destroy habitat of wildlife without any second thoughts? Or why do people mistreat their own pets or their cattle? Or why do people poach endangered animals? Or why do people cut down whole forests needlessly? There is an answer to it, but the answer can't be found among man's thoughts. The answer is one thing. The answer is sin. The answer is always sin. Why does that happen? Go back to the root of the problem. Is it greed? Probably. Is it thoughtlessness? Is it selfishness? Is it gluttony? It is. And so what is it? Why do people destroy the environment that God has created? Because they sin. They don't think of it in those terms, but most of the time that really is what it boils down to. And so how do we respond to this then? There's a few things that we can say, and what we will say in response to this. The first thing to acknowledge is this: the majority the vast majority of people who are concerned about the created world are people who don't even believe that the world was created. The majority of people that are concerned about environmentalism, as they call it, are people who generally don't have a belief in God. And yet they're the ones that are activists, they're the ones that are the naturalists, the biologists, anything to do with this field. And where does that leave Christians? It leaves them out to the side to say, well, hopefully they'll take care of it, but they're a little too far anyway, so I don't think we should be following them. But it does become a problem when it's only non-Christians that are concerned about God's created world. Okay? So we end up not being any of these things. And there is a balance to this. From my own perspective, I'm not concerned when we talk about climate change. At least not that it's disastrous or happening so rapidly that we can't do anything to solve the problems it could create. I'm not concerned about that. We've talked about that before here. But am I concerned about certain parts of the environment? Yeah, I am. I'm concerned about some parts of God's created world. I'm concerned a little bit about habitat loss, about the extinction of certain species, reducing this biodiversity that we're talking about. Concerned about clean drinking water. Is that important to you as an individual? Probably should be. I'm a little bit concerned about air pollution. I'm concerned about sustainable forestry. I'm concerned about the potential of pesticide runoff, of soil erosion, really any kind of bad practices when it comes to farming. I'm concerned about those things on some level. Now, none of those things are world-ending, but they are problems. And that's probably another thing to bring into this. There's an idea among Christians, and actually Wayne and I just talked about this before church. There's an idea among Christians a lot of times that God will not let the world be destroyed by man. Right? That's true, isn't it? God's going to be the one that has the final say. And so when we use that phrase, though, most of the time we're using it to justify our actions. To say, well, we can't do anything to destroy the world, so what does it really matter? Let's reframe that with a different historical event. Is God going to let humanity kill itself? No. But will he let them kill 75 million people over the course of a 5-year war that we call World War II? Yeah, he'll let that happen. Would it go a long way in the destruction of the world to do all of these things that we were talking about negatively to God's created environment? Yeah, it would. God will be the one who says that the world will end, but that doesn't mean that we can't harm ourselves in the magnitude of millions of people dead if we want to, because we've proven ourselves to be capable of that again and again through our own sin, through our own bad choices that we make. And so what do we say then in response to these things? Well, if we're talking about solutions, the first thing is this. The only solution is through Christianity. As self-righteous as a lot of people that talk about this discussion are whenever they are being activists for the environment, as right as they think they are, the question would be, what is their basis for absolute right and absolute wrong? Do they have one? They can't, aside from a worldview that says that there is a real God that created the world and that he establishes what is right and what is wrong. Christianity, therefore, is the only response to this. You can't have something that is inherently right or inherently wrong without Christianity or without some belief system in God. That's something that most of the people that are concerned about the environment lack entirely. And so if there are no absolute wrongs and someone is concerned about the environment, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. What would there be wrong with me deciding that I want to take a little trip to China and to hunt giant pandas? They're endangered, right? That'd be pretty bad, you think. What's wrong with that? If God doesn't exist and there is no true value of right and wrong, sounds like a good trip, right? There is something wrong with it because God created biodiversity, as we discussed, because God created these things and said they were good. But God is the basis of right and wrong. There is no other. And so there's a great irony in letting people that don't believe in God, in letting people that don't believe in absolute right and wrong try to tell us that something is wrong or that something is right. But we kind of stand to the side and let that happen. The second part of this, as far as on an individual basis, we as Christians ought to recognize the Creator's work. Again, as we've said several times in this lesson already, when God did create everything in Genesis chapter 1, verse 31, on that sixth day after he had made man, he said that it was very good. Well, God has created this world, and he put man here. Sometimes we even describe man, before the fall especially, as the masterpiece of God's creation. But really, the whole creation is a masterpiece, right? And we can appreciate nature to the extent that God has been the one to create the beauty that we find there. If God is the creator of these things, if he is the artist behind this world, then how are we going to treat it? The analogy would be if you happen to have a painting by Claude Monet, if you were the possessor of it, which I don't think there is a Monet that's worth less than $1 million, but if you happen to own that, what do you do with it? Is it your coaster? Is it your doorstop? You scrape mud off your tires with it? What do you do with it? Well, who created the world? And how often do we stop to consider the value of that created world when we're acting in it and treating it one way or another? You wouldn't tear up a Picasso. You wouldn't treat a valuable piece of art in a negative way, and yet we're sometimes willing to do that with God's own creation. A third thing is for Christians to spend more time in the created world or learning more about the created world. I know for some people that sounds like school. I know for some people that they just don't like to be outside. But the problem is, when I spend all of my time in here, what am I seeing? I'm seeing a room that man made. I'm seeing a space that is only created by an architect, by some builders, and you slap some paint on it and put some lights. If that's all I ever see, how much can I appreciate what God's made? If I'm never in the creation, then what do I care what God has created or what happens to it? And so we as Christians would be better served to spend more time learning about what God has created and being in that creation. Also, look at the bulletin if you haven't already, because that's kind of the gist of that as well. And so a lot of this does come back to knowledge. It comes to learning how you can be a better manager of what God has given, whether that's the potted plants on your patio, or whether that's your yard, whether that's your farm. How can you be a manager of what God has given to you? And that goes a lot farther than just not actively hurting the world that he's created, but maybe helping it out a little bit as well. Because ultimately, it is God's creation. He will provide for it. He will take care of it, but we don't want to be found working against God as he's trying to take care of his own. One other way, maybe to try to convince somebody, in Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 1, we're told to be imitators of God. If we're talking about being an imitator of God and then talking about the created world, what's the example? What's the pattern? God is the loving, the compassionate caretaker of this world. If I'm going to imitate God to some extent, I have to reflect that. I cannot imitate God and turn a complete blind eye to the destruction of the world. Again, God will do the actual destroying, but you understand on the small scale. So if we want to be more like God, you can tell a lot about somebody based on how they treat the things around them, whether that be their own possessions or whether that be the yard that they keep or don't, the way that they treat animals or how poorly they treat them. And when we look to God, we get an example of how we are to take care of the things that he has made. Now, all of this, and this is where we'll end, all of this is not a matter of salvation that we would normally talk about. Although it probably can be, because it's all tied back to sin, and the mistreating of the things that God has created ultimately is going to come from some sin of pride or greed. But it is an issue that is worth considering. Because regardless, it is a matter of how we express our love toward God, how willing we are to be not just part of the created world, but be part of those who tend and keep it as he commanded the first man ever to do. So this is not a lesson to say that you have to go out tomorrow and hold up a sign at the courthouse and be some kind of activist, but it is a lesson to say there's a lot more that we could do just in the way of learning about what God has made and appreciating what He has made. People already don't care enough about God, but if we don't even care enough to know what God has done, whether that be written in His Word or whether that be in the world that He's created, then why should they care either? This evening, it is worth our time to look at this, but it's also worth our time, as always, to offer God's invitation. God didn't create this world to be permanent. He did create it, and He said it was very good, and it's a place that serves His purposes. And it's a place that will continue to serve His purposes until such time as it's no longer needed. But He also created us. He created us with a choice to make, an eternal choice. The choice is either to follow God, to be an imitator of Him, or the choice is to follow the world, to follow Satan, ultimately to follow sin. Tonight you have that choice set in front of you. Tonight either you can choose God or you can choose the world. But this evening, if you have any need of the church, we ask that you come forward now as we stand, as we sing.
Great